Good morning. My name is Sherry Altschuler, and I'm a partner in the capital markets and corporate groups at Aird & Burles. I am also co-chair of our Cannabis group. Aird & Burles is a Toronto-based law firm with a national and international cannabis practice. It is my pleasure to welcome you here today for our webinar, How to Thrive in the Canadian Cannabis Retail Market. We have today over 590 attendees registered, and they are from around the globe. Thank you all for joining us. I would like to introduce our talented group of speakers for today. With me at this table in Toronto are Karen Fung. Karen is Vice President in the Transaction Advisory Services Group at E&Y and has 15 years of experience in advising both private and public sector companies. Karen has advised all three levels of government in a diverse capacity, helping them understand and make informed decisions around their financial, operational, and economic situations. In the private sector, Karen specializes in companies that are experiencing financial difficulties, working with both debtors, lenders, bondholders through informal consulting assignments and formal court proceedings related to debt and operational structuring and restructuring. Ashley Chu is also here today. Ashley is an E&Y's strategic growth and risk leader and global SMR for the cannabis and hemp industries. Ashley provides strategic and new market entry advisory services to Fortune 500 companies and companies in adjacent industries to help diversify their businesses through exploring strategic opportunities in the cannabis and hemp industries. Ashley also designs and implements business processes, policies, procedures, and controls over financial reporting and ERP systems in support of cannabis companies going public or uplisting on the New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ. We also have with us today Neil Klassen. Neil is the Director of Business Strategy at 7 Point Interiors, a division launched by the team at Visual Elements to help develop retail expertise in the emerging cannabis industry. He is known for being an expert in display, and his philosophy on his work is to design and build things that are relevant and last for at least a quarter of a century. I also have with me my partner, Jeremy. Jeremy Burke is a member of Aird & Burles' Corporate Commercial Group and Cannabis Group. His corporate commercial practice focuses on business mergers, acquisitions, and dispositions, as well as corporate structuring and ongoing corporate governance, commercial agreements, business ownership arrangements, and other corporate commercial matters. In cannabis, Jeremy advises cannabis industry participants from LPs to retailers to packaging suppliers to future edibles and extracts businesses. Thank you all for joining us here today. I'd like to turn it over to our speakers now for this jam-packed session on our retail market in Canada.
Thanks, Sherry. This is Jeremy. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We thought it would make sense to start with sort of an overview of the regulatory landscape so that we can sort of get past the basics and then get into the more interesting stuff. So I'll be talking for a little bit on the regulatory landscape. I'm going to be covering a lot, so I'll generally just be moving through it pretty quickly. And if you guys have questions, you can submit those. And if we have time at the end, we'll look forward to addressing them. So, as I'm sure most or all of you know, our Canada's federal cannabis legislation, the Cannabis Act, legalized recreational cannabis across the country when it came into force last year in October. The Federal Act establishes, it does a lot of things. One of the things is it establishes criminal sanctions for various activities, but it also regulates primarily the commercial production of cannabis, and it also regulates the distribution and sale of medical cannabis throughout the country. So while all aspects of commercial production and sale of medical cannabis are governed solely by the federal statute, authority to regulate the distribution and sale of recreational cannabis has been expressly delegated to the provinces in the federal statute. So the provincial legislation, in addition to governing distribution, and sale of recreational cannabis in the particular province. Also imposes rules relating to transportation of cannabis, places of consumption, personal possession limits, and also minimum age for consumption and personal cultivation limits. There is some overlap between rules in the Federal Act and provincial legislation, in particular with respect to minimum ages for consumption, personal cultivation limits, and others. At this point, the safest course is really to adhere to whichever law is more restrictive in terms of its rules. The municipal government also plays a role in the regulation of cannabis. It's a fairly limited role. It relates primarily to land uses and building code compliance, and Neil will be talking about that a bit later. And municipalities can also limit permitted places to smoke and vape cannabis if they're doing that in a way that's more restrictive than what's set out in the Smoke-Free Ontario Act. So our next slide has a chart that sort of generally points out how each of the provinces and territories in Canada have dealt with retail recreational cannabis. So really there's three models. There's the fully public model, fully private model, and a hybrid model. The public model means generally that cannabis retail and distribution is entirely government run. So physical stores, online sale, and wholesaling of cannabis would all be done by the government or a government crown corporation. 6 jurisdictions have followed that model: Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PEI, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. The only 2 provinces that have gone fully private are Manitoba and Saskatchewan, where privately licensed businesses operate retail, both physical and online, and also distribution, so wholesale distribution from LPs to the private retailers. And the rest of the other 5 jurisdictions have gone hybrid, including Ontario, which generally means online sale is regulated only by the provinces, and retail sale is online sale is conducted only by the provinces, and physical retail sale is operated by private licensed retailers. So looking at at Ontario specifically, the relevant statutes, so I've got the Cannabis Control Act, the License Act, and the Smoke-Free Act there. The Cannabis Control Act regulates possession, consumption, distribution, transportation, among other things. It does a number, has a lot of rules, but it's the tool that's used by police agencies to enforce against illegal cannabis dispensaries in the province. The Cannabis License Act establishes the licensing regime for recreational cannabis retailers, and the Smoke-Free Ontario Act governs where you can smoke and vape. The other statute that's not mentioned there, which should be, is the Ontario Cannabis Retail Corporation Act. That's the statute that permitted the formation of the Ontario Cannabis Retail Corporation, better known as the Ontario Cannabis Store. And it's the Ontario Cannabis Store that has the exclusive right in Ontario to conduct online sale of recreational cannabis, and it acts as the sole wholesale distributor of recreational cannabis from federal license holders to authorized private retail cannabis stores. The regulator, as I'm sure most of you know, is the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario, so they've added cannabis to their retinue of regulated industries, including alcohol, gaming, and certain elements of horse racing as well. So the AGCO issues licenses, and they'll also oversee retailers on an ongoing basis using their powers of inspection and the requirement for licensees to obtain approval to take certain actions, such as license renewals, changes, or transfers. So the required licenses, there's 3 licenses that a business owner would need in order to commence operating a retail cannabis store in Ontario. The retail operator license is essentially focuses on the eligibility of the person that's going to operate the store, and in addition to just the individual, or more likely the corporation, the AGCO is interested in learning about any other individuals that have an ownership or an other economic interest in the store. So this would be people such as shareholders and also landlords and lenders or other business partners potentially as well. there'll be more from my co-panelists on that later. The retail store authorization focuses on the eligibility of the proposed store itself, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then the cannabis retail manager license is required by any individual who's conducting certain management functions at the store. So in terms of store requirements, I think the easiest way to talk about it is to sort of consider what you'd look at first. And the very first thing you should consider if you're looking to open a cannabis store in a particular place is whether the municipality that it's in has opted out from having any cannabis stores. There are 77 of Ontario's slightly over 400 municipalities that have opted out. Surely a number of them, if not most of them, will opt back in at some point, but currently a cannabis store in any one of those 77 municipalities is not a possibility. The AGCO just won't issue a license for a store there. So if the municipality is in, then the first thing you'd want to check is whether the proposed location is zoned for retail or commercial, whatever the applicable bylaw, whatever the applicable zoning designation is in that municipality. And it's important to note that municipalities are not permitted to establish a special zoning designation for cannabis retail. They have to apply whatever retail, whatever zoning would apply to any other retail business. But of course, operators still have to comply with zoning, the applicable zoning bylaw, the Ontario Building Code, etc. The third thing I would check is whether your store is within 150 meters of any private or public school. And those are sort of the preconditions. At that point, you're sort of into more store-specific things, and I won't talk too much about that, but you know, the rules are created by the Cannabis License Act regulation, Regulation 468, as well as the AGCO's registrar standards. The registrar standards for cannabis stores are principles-based standards. They set out sort of very straightforward rules, if I can put it that way. There's lots of complexity to it in the implementation of the rules, but the rule itself is very brief, unlike in certain jurisdictions like Alberta, where the rules are highly prescriptive. So just quickly, some of those store standards cover what equipment, security, training, inventory security, record keeping, rules for preventing unlawful activity, and also rules that really just drop down the federal requirements that apply to any cannabis sale activity, including in particular on advertising and promotion, which we'll be talking a fair bit about. So currently where we're at, as I'm sure a lot of listeners will know, there's a current limit of 25 retail store authorizations in Ontario. The brief history of that is that under the Wynne government, there was a plan to have a fully public model, online and retail only by the government, physical retail only by the government. The Ford government changed that plan. They switched physical stores to being licensed to private businesses. And then in mid-December, they announced a further shift from the initial plan of having a potentially unlimited number of stores to having just 25 stores. This was before there was legislation, before there was regulations made under the legislation, and before the AGCO had a chance to prepare to implement the as yet unestablished licensing framework. So that led to a bit of a mad scramble. And the lottery that resulted from that decision has sort of, it's been a very interesting journey, and we don't have time to talk about it in too great detail at this point, but really what happened is the government decided that they should allow anybody who wanted to pay $75 to enter the lottery, which resulted in over 17,000 people in Ontario doing just that. The vast majority of them having, had prior to that having had no intention to at least immediately get into the cannabis business. So this cap that we're at right now at 25 is currently set to expire on December 13th, 2019, at which point, absent any further regulatory amendments, the market would open up to permit an unlimited number of stores, the way it was originally intended, up to 75 per eligible operator. And I guess the new update on that front is the 2019 Ontario budget foreshadows that the government is anticipating that they may in fact continue to phase in store licensing. The budget uses language including future allocations of retail store authorizations, and it indicates really that so long as supply chain issues exist, that the existing number of permitted stores will continue to be limited, which makes some sense. There needs to be supply so that business owners aren't facing the situation they are in Alberta, which is becoming insolvent because they have insufficient supply of cannabis. And we have an article actually coming out on the 2019 budget in a couple of days. So currently in Ontario, the 24 of the 25 available retail store authorizations have had applications for those RSAs submitted. Nearly all of the applicants, including the one that we represent here, have partnered with sophisticated retail operators. And in the circumstances, that makes perfect sense. The lottery winners have limited retail experience. But they have what's currently perceived as the right to acquire a very valuable commodity, a license for one of the first 25 stores. And of course, it's in everyone's best interest for Ontario cannabis store operators to have the retail support that they need to develop a high-quality business that's going to be appealing to consumers, operate in a safe and compliant fashion, and therefore that reflects well on the province entirely. So that's where we're at right now in Ontario. I think at the latest toll is about 10 of the 25 stores are actually opened, and based on what I'm hearing from other lottery winners' lawyers, and Neil, you may have a better insight on this, I expect we'll probably see most, if not all, of the 25 open sort of by June.
At the latest.
Right,
yeah.
if not a bit sooner. So very quickly on other provinces. Alberta has 75 retail stores licensed. BC has 14 retail stores approved. Manitoba has 22. Saskatchewan actually has the same number. And Newfoundland, these are just the hybrid jurisdictions. Newfoundland wins on a per capita basis with 25 stores operating, but apparently they also pay slightly higher than the national average for a gram of cannabis, which is the national average is currently right around $8. So very, very briefly on new products, because I'm sure a lot of you are interested in the pending edibles regulations, which ultimately will have a significant influence on the retail market. Currently, the only forms of cannabis that are permitted are to be sold in Canada are dried flower, fresh flower, cannabis oil, plants, and seeds, although you can't get plants in a lot of jurisdictions. Come October, the cannabis regulations are to be amended to also add edible cannabis, cannabis extracts, and cannabis topicals. I'm not going to take the time to sort of go into much detail about that. Generally speaking, edible cannabis are products containing cannabis that are intended to be consumed in the same way that food or drink are consumed. Extracts are cannabis oil is one extract, so oil will be subsumed within this new category called cannabis extracts, which is any cannabis product produced using an extraction processing method or by synthesizing cannabis, such as hash, rosin, shatter, waxes, and oils. And topicals are anything that contains cannabis intended to be used on external body surfaces, patches, sprays, lotions, lubricants, that kind of thing. Those are the new products that are coming. A quick point, because it's probably the most common question I face these days, is can I sell CBD? Can I import CBD? Can I consume CBD? Without is it treated in the same way essentially as other cannabis products? And at this point, the answer is yes. Any cannabinoid is treated in the same fashion as THC, the one that has a psychoactive effect. And I'm with probably most of you in hoping that won't last for very long. It's hard to imagine why a non-intoxicating substance should be treated in the same fashion as an intoxicating substance for regulatory purposes. So hopefully that'll change. Unfortunately, it'll require statutory amendments to make that happen, given that the definition of cannabis is in the statute itself, not the regulations. So it's not going to happen in the short term, hopefully in the medium term. And the other question I face a lot is about industrial hemp. So yes, there are certain activities that the holders of an industrial hemp license can do with industrial hemp, but extraction of CBD from industrial hemp is not one of them. That activity and anything else that really involves CBD as a medicinal ingredient requires that the person doing that activity have a Cannabis Act license, not an industrial hemp license. So that's my rapid-fire overview of the regulatory landscape, and I think we'll pass it off to Karen now.
Yeah. Thanks, Jeremy. That was excellent.
Thanks, Sherry.
Karen's going to talk on what are the regulators really focused on when reviewing an application. Very interested to hear your insight, Karen.
Thanks, Sherry. So the rules and regulations and objectives of each of the provincial licensing authorities are very simple and straightforward. That's public interest, away from the illicit market, and lawful operations. Where it gets a little more complicated is how you execute ensuring that your applicants and operators are abiding by these sort of principles. Just for full disclosure, I am doing work with the AGCO, so I'm going to be very cautious with any details, but definitely can shed some light on what this truly means and how this works. So first, you send your application, and this is just the first step. Then it's followed by a due diligence process. And that due diligence process, because of what they're trying to achieve, means they're going to look into where the sources of funding are from, your personal and business history, and the extent of your relationships. And I want to expand on extent of your relationships. So as you are working through how your business model is going to work, you might come across other partners or and other ventures who are interested in helping you. So maybe you wanted a consultant because you're new. Maybe you wanted to franchise. Maybe you wanted to use somebody's IP or their name. The more people that you include in your business relationships means the more people that have to be part of the scope of due diligence. So that's something to think about when you're talking about the timing of, how long is it going to take for me to get my license? Is that, because sometimes people forget that process includes very much back and forth of additional documentation, and sometimes the documentation provided is not good enough and needs to be either updated, extended, and so forth. And this does add to that timing. And one of the things, especially for sure, definitely in Ontario, is that you cannot order or purchase from the OCS until you have all your ducks in a row and you have that license offered to you. And, that's not even taking into account the protocols within the OCS that have their own timing. So, for example, as we talk about the 10 stores that were licensed, that doesn't necessarily mean that those 10 stores or every single time there's a notification that another store has a license. It doesn't mean that they're open on that day. It means that they have the license to now order, and then they will open according to when they can get product into their store. So that's just something to really think about when you're going through that application process. So I think more interesting is how has this affected the Ontario candidates and their efforts of others in the industry to participate in the retail sector. As we've seen, out of the 25 licenses, just looking at the names of the retail spaces, it's very easy to see that there are connections. We have, just to name a few names, Canna Cabana, Tweed, Spirit Leaf. So there are extents that they're, like I said, receiving potentially some consulting help. They could be using the name. The list goes on as to how these individuals are involved. As mentioned, as you continue growing your partnerships or relationships with individuals, that widens the web of people that have to be considered as honest, lawful, and disconnected from organized crime. The Ontario space for sure has had that extra layer with the lottery process added onto it, which has shortened the due diligence process, making people like myself run through various methods to find and to perform the necessary objectives of the AGCO. So that could mean reaching out into any open source sources of information, looking through various databases, going through court documents, social media scans, internet searches, whatever it takes to find out everything about every single partner that you have. The other one is with Ontario, because of the shortened time frame, there's been a very sharp learning curve, not only for these individuals as business owners, but also learning about the cannabis industry and how these two intersect. So what I wanted to touch upon from some of the lessons learned, because as mentioned, December 13th, there's expectations that there will be more licenses opening up. There are three things that I want to share with this group. The first one is, protecting yourself from negative business relationships. As mentioned, the more people that you open up, the greater that risk is. And knowing how do you decouple from somebody if at the end of the day you find out that they are not the right person that you want to be associated with or company. The second one is sort of creating an agreement that don't violate the rules and regulations. There are certain agreements that are out there that you might have certain milestones that have to be met. For example, when those milestones happen, you have to be very cognizant if they break any of the rules. In addition, to negative business relationships, you can only do what is within your own realm, but you can't. There are external factors of for example, your business partner, of what they do and how they grow and progress. And as they grow and have their own business relationships change, that may potentially violate the rules and regulations for your license. So these are sort of things that to maybe think about as you're sort of creating these partnerships. And the last one that I wanted to highlight was sort of the understanding of affiliated companies with respect to licensed producers. Affiliated companies, I think, if you ask any lawyer, is different under any law and regulation, and this one is a bit complex. But with respect to licensed producers, there is very specific rules and regulations associated with the ownership of licensed producers. And I believe that this is being overlooked in the future, because when the stores do open up, the number of applications open up and the licenses open up, I'm pretty sure a lot of these licensed producers are going to apply for their one license. And this may impact all the other retail operators, depending on your agreement. So these are just things to really think about when you're developing these relationships, just making sure that you really understand how this will play out as you grow and your partners grow.
Karen, I think it's a great point about affiliates. I don't know so the regulation where the definition of affiliate was published, the number of words in the regulation, 20% of the number of words in the regulation were taken up by the definition of affiliate. It's unbelievable.
Exactly.
Create a compliance, right?
So we're going to turn it over to Ashley Chu now. Ashley?
Great, thank you very much. So I think we've talked a lot about Ontario-specific regulations and what's been happening across the country. I'd like to now touch upon what the Cannabis Act stipulates. So the Cannabis Act really does govern the cultivation, processing, as well as marketing, promotions, anything of that sort as it pertains to cannabis. So right now, retailers are not allowed to have loyalty programs or marketing practices that are seen to be inducing purchases of cannabis products or accessories. Currently, Health Canada is reviewing a loyalty program out in Winnipeg, which allows registered customers to earn points from purchases of cannabis and accessories, participating in product reviews, celebrating an event, sharing with social media posts, as well as referring their friends to create accounts. Now, some of these activities may seem like they're not cannabis touching, and you would be right. However, the Act stipulates that you're not actually able to induce purchases by offering discounts or points that customers can then apply to subsequent purchases. So that's what's being reviewed right now, and we'll see what Health Canada says about that. Now, the only branding and marketing practices that are allowable are brand preference, which includes things like showcasing a logo or your brand name or your trademark, and information marketing. And so all of this marketing has to happen in an age-gated environment, and what that means is that it must be reasonable that only those of legal age, as stipulated by the province, and in Ontario it is 19, have access to this type of advertising and marketing. And so Health Canada has also come out to say that one-click age verification on online channels is not enough to prove that you're in compliance with the Cannabis Act. And so retailers and licensed producers and companies affiliated with marketing and advertising in the cannabis industry need to be thinking about this as well. One thing that retailers are not able to do is allow for products and cannabis products and cannabis accessories to be tried in store or give out samples or any type of giveaways. And at this time, there's also no on-site consumption. Now, British Columbia has come out to say very definitively that in the short term, there will be no on-site consumption. Ontario hasn't necessarily made that same direct stance. It's a possibility that in the future, perhaps, consumption will be allowed on-site. However, whether or not that's within a retailer or a non-retailer, that is remained to be seen. And so one thing that is specific to Ontario is cannabis products and accessories cannot be visible from the exterior of the store. That just won't be allowed. So either it's tinted windows or a barrier in front of these products needs to be thought about to be in compliance with the Act. And next, I know we've talked a lot about things that we can't do. I think it'd be great to shine a light on the things that are allowable under the Cannabis Act. And so back to the fact that, the messaging for marketing really is centered around two things. The things that are not allowed are testimonials, anything that's appealing to youth, sponsorship, lifestyle marketing, depiction with things such as people, characters, and animals. To date, there have been no major Health Canada issued fines. However, Health Canada has been quite collaborative in the approach of reviewing marketing materials after they've been published. And, if there is an issue with some materials that have been put out in the market, they typically get in contact with you and work with you to get you back into compliance. But that's not to say that, that it's a free-for-all. I think prior to the Cannabis Act coming into effect, a lot of cannabis companies and affiliates would be marketing with a bit more liberally, and you may have seen some billboards on the Gardner. That, frankly, isn't allowed under the Cannabis Act, and since then, many cannabis companies, retailers, and licensed producers have then since scaled back their marketing operations. And so the type of information and education that I think is really important for consumers to learn about is cannabinoids and terpenes. We touched about, the different molecular components of cannabis very briefly, but I think it's important to know that as human beings, we have an endocannabinoid system within our own bodies. And so we also have an endocannabinoid tone that modulates how cannabis affects us. And really, it is a personal experience. Some people react differently to different cannabinoids and terpenes, and so that, I think, is really important to understand for yourself, and start to talk to the bud tenders or the people at the stores who are able to provide more education for you. The other thing that I want to point out is that cannabis purchasing really is an experiential experience. I think most people want to see what they're buying, they want to be able to smell it, and so I think product display is going to be really important, as well as merchandising, where you're able to showcase products in compliant ways, but then also show, designs and displays that are engaging and tell a story and feature brands or themes. And we have some great material coming up that Neil's put together, and I'll let him showcase that. But I think merchandising is one of the often overlooked opportunities in this space. Additionally, I've seen some really successful retail locations across the country have workshops. And so these are things like, how to roll a joint, because I think you'd be surprised to learn that most people don't understand and aren't actually able to do it on their first try. Or learning a little bit about, about how to create your own lotions. That's something that is currently not allowable to be sold under the Cannabis Act. However, if you want to make your own at home, you're able to do so. And so I think these workshops really create a more engaging experience and open up the cannabis environment to people who are less experienced or are looking for a bit more education. Social media, I think, is actually one of the tools that cannabis companies are able to use to reach their audience. Granted that Facebook has come out to say that they have a quite prohibitive stance on cannabis, so they will not be open to having cannabis companies have their accounts or promote products or any type of marketing and advertisement. And because Facebook also owns Instagram, we've seen that in the past, and actually very recently, that accounts have been taken down, posts have been taken down, and just banned from the sites because of their current stance. So actually, Twitter has been a way that I've seen a lot of companies reach out and engage their audiences. And in the same realm, using influencers and brand consultants who you're able to leverage their social networks to speak to a broader audience, I think that's one channel that's been quite successful. And we've seen, celebrities partner with cannabis companies and act as brand consultants, either licensing their products or, engaging in co-product development. And I think if you're able to segment the market even further and find a target consumer base that you want to speak to, I think those are great avenues to do so. Another thing that I'd like to touch upon is opt-in email marketing. Now, I know that most people think that if you get, an unwarranted email in your email box, it goes straight to the trash. But what's interesting about the cannabis industry is that a lot of these targeted emails have been opted in, and prior to that have been age verified. So theoretically, that becomes a base to which you can talk to very specifically and talk about what you're offering in your store or when you plan to restock, or things like deals that are going on, and that's been quite successful as well. I think the last thing that I'd like to touch upon would be having cannabis representatives collaborate with retailers. And so in markets like Alberta, there is something called a qualified cannabis representative who has gone through security and background checks and is also involved and has taken the province-mandated training courses, has gone through, security clearance and some type of rigor to evaluate the company and the individual prior to being able to market and distribute on behalf of the retailer. And so that type of framework doesn't currently exist in Ontario. However, I do encourage that, there are individuals and professionals out there that do have this experience and understand cannabis and do have these networks, and it's a great idea to partner with them and leverage their knowledge to the best of your ability.
Thank you, Ashley. I think creative compliance is a very important aspect of this industry, because often when we get calls, our clients don't want us to only tell them what they cannot do. They're trying to help find solutions to the challenges operating in a very regulated landscape, and they see others in the sector, and for example, Canopy as a licensed producer advertising in movie theaters for R-rated movies because that is an age-gated environment. Or other examples like the Craft Beer Festival this summer, who's come up with a consumption zone that they're referring to as a patio, so that they can address some of the challenges that they have for hosting events, social events, and outdoor spaces. Let's turn it over to Neil.
Great, thank you. And some great information already on the regulatory. I think we're going to venture a little bit further into the soft science behind selling cannabis and what your retail space can look like and what you can do in the building and design phase to elevate your presentation or define it. One of my first observations, as I've worked in retail building my entire life, in the cannabis space I found that there's a lot of people that are extremely new to retail, and much of this information is very new to them. So why I wanted to deal with realistic timelines is because I think a lot of people who've entered the space had very unrealistic expectations on what could be done in a certain amount of time. Now, obviously with the lottery, we actually had to then disprove that and create these wonderful spaces in a ridiculously short period of time. But I'll stress that that is not ideal. So the graph that you see on the first slide here is an actual timeline that was made. The opening date for this particular store is April 1st, but the plan was made 7 months ago. So I'm not saying that 7 months is what you need, but I'll tell you right now that if you have time, use it and give yourself as much time as possible. So I said be realistic is what I was going to say, but in this industry it's be as realistic as possible. Things move fast and you'll have to move fast and you'll have to find partners that can move fast with you. I said you'll want to be involved. Absolutely, you want personal involvement with your design team so that you can be part of this process. It's probably one of the most fun parts of developing your retail operation. Great design takes time, so not only do you have to work with great designers, you got to make sure that you have enough time to actually deliver that. And not only that, you also then, after your design, you have to engineer all these things. So compliance is different in every province, as we've already heard. So you'll want to make sure that your compliance advisors are in contact with your design teams so that they can help each other to get to something where you're not making mistakes on opening day. And it's not just compliance, right? We're talking about team building. So you want your store building team to know what POS system you're using. If you're using COVA or something, we want to know so that we can work with it. Permitting, holy cow, that really truly never ends. It's not just your permit to sell cannabis. I mean, you've got building permits, you've got electrical permits, you've got your retail licenses. All of these things need to be in place, and don't expect them to come in on time. All of these things can completely blow up your plan. The more time you have once your design is done and you're going in, now you have to go and look for builders to build these things and contractors for your space. The more time you have to look for more bids, the better value you're going to get. So again, try to give yourself a little there. To go back to your license application, currently you have to have a floor plan, which essentially is part of your design process. Karen will probably agree that if you have your complete store design and conceptual design in place by the time you do your license application, these things all help. And again, if you've given yourself enough time, you will open with a smile. So what we learned from the lottery, Jeremy's already touched on some of these things. I'd say the only good thing that came out of the lottery is we had an extremely overheated retail market where people that wanted to get into this space, as soon as they said, look, I'm going to open a cannabis store, your rent just went up by 5-fold. We've seen things that are absolutely unreasonable. The good thing with the lottery is it somewhat burst that bubble quite effectively. The bad part, the lottery was meant to facilitate fair access. So as Jeremy explained, if you had $75, you could get in. So that should have opened the gate, but it didn't, right? Because once you got your license, now you needed to look for all kinds of partners to actually make this happen. And the same people that were already ready to get into the retail market were the ones that had to bail out the lottery winners. So some of the most prepared applicants lost their shirts. I think this is really important to remember because this is a high-risk industry. You need to know that no matter when you get into it, rules can change, things can change. If you're not properly financed, this may not be a good place for you to be. As I already said, the lottery winners needed the outside help, and it was exactly from those people that, in a way, the lottery was supposed to keep out. So why lottery? But we know that there's other reasons. The timelines were very unrealistic when they did come out with the lottery. What that did is it made it very expensive for all the retailers to get stuff done, because if you have to rush things, well, rushing costs a lot. So the last point is the real reason that the lottery did happen is the government was simply unprepared to handle the system they created themselves. They knew that they only had 50 people to give out the applications and no time to actually deal with that application process. Let's get into the fun part of this. So we're talking about breaking the stigma, how design greatly affects the accessibility of cannabis to a larger audience. So obviously with legalization, we are now going to present this product to a far larger audience than was traditionally out there. Cannabis used to be sold from a cowboy boots and a guy on the streets, and he would give you whatever he had. That is no longer the case. So now, my first point, and I'm passionate about this one, elevate the presentation. This is not just because I work in high-end retail. We know that if you're playing in the upper echelon of retail, you'll do well. Higher-end retail has always done well. So this image here is one that I truly love. We've seen all kinds of bud bars that are a table with product on it. This thing is a piece of art. And it's, you basically can create drama in your store. This is a retail environment that anybody would want to visit. Next slide is actually, so this is Prairie Records, which is Westleaf out west. This is the only slide, the only project that I didn't directly work on, but I'm a fan of this. So what they've done is they've taken the old record store, and which is now, of course, no longer. You won't find very many vinyl stores. And they've used the album cover as their way of selling cannabis. It's genius. If you look closely on the record covers, you'll see certain bands that look like a piece of a record, while the shading indicates the intensity of the cannabis itself. So as soon as you walk up to this, then intuitively you'll know if it's strong or if it's weak, and that's really important for most clients. And then you take these album covers to the front desk and they'll put together your order for you. They've cracked this path to purchase in an analog way, which I'm also a big fan of, because I think we're way too dependent on digital display screens in retail nowadays. Next slide. So great renderings tell a story. I think Spirit Leaf was very smart in having their design done well before anything else. And they had this wonderful rendering, which is now a bit iconic because everybody's seen it in different magazine articles. They managed to use this rendering to create excitement. So they got funding through this. They got client through this. They just simply used this work well ahead of time to build their business and do a lot of advertising. So the next slide is color, which is, don't be afraid of it. There's a lot of stores out there that try to be very conservative, but the modern shopper wants color in their environment. But not only do they want it just for aesthetic reasons, you can actually use color to differentiate between strains, whether you're selling hybrids, whether you're selling indicas, sativas. You can do so much with color, and I strongly suggest you use it. There's one little design tip on this, is you can't really see them, but in behind the counters, there's these low storage units. They're on wheels. There is this part where you have to remove the cannabis from your shop floor and put it into a vault overnight. If you can facilitate that in a clever way, I strongly suggest you do so. So now this one is probably the most famous cannabis store in the country, because it's the first legal store in Toronto. This foyer is gorgeous. We actually used perforated metal that show a honeycomb. If you look carefully, there is no honeycomb in that. It's a visual effect. It was a wonderful thing to do. But if you have enough room to have a foyer, do so, because it allows you to check IDs, and you become immediately compliant as far as your space is concerned. You have to make sure that people can't look from outside the door, even if it just opens up. And this is only in Ontario, by the way. It's not that way in Alberta, but you simply can't see any cannabis of any kind. But here's the most important takeaway. That wall that you see there with the brand, everybody who goes into the store takes a selfie, posts it on social media, which they can do, and it's got your brand on it. And that wraps up my little piece.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, Karen, Ashley, and Neil. That was excellent. We do have a few moments for some questions that have been coming in. And I think that I'd like to turn the first one over to Ashley. The question is, what is the status of certain illicit products like edibles, extracts, and topicals that I hear are not legal, but many groups are selling them at registered events and active dispensaries?
Yeah, thanks, Sherry. So right now, under the Cannabis Act, as Jeremy mentioned, there are only few available formats that are legally able to be sold at retailers, and that is dried flower, oil, plants, seeds. And so all of the additional product formats that you have seen in the market likely are not produced by licensed producers in Canada that have been licensed for manufacturing the allowable product formats currently. And in terms of registered events and active dispensaries, I mean, typically these retailers do have to be in compliance with the Cannabis Act, as well as the provincial legislation that governs whichever province they're in. So I don't want to speculate, but I would say that because we haven't even seen the full regulations come out from Health Canada and just the proposed regs, I'd have to say that they're just not legal at this time.
And if active dispensaries refers to a non-AGCO licensed dispensary, everything they sell there is illicit, right?
Correct.
And the products you're talking about are shatter and those kind of things. So.
Yeah.
Exactly. Jeremy, over to you. Could you address issues and concerns that might affect licensed producers who also want to open retail stores?
Right. Okay. So the framework for that is once the retail market in Ontario reopens, so once the limit of 25 retail store authorizations goes away, licensed producers are entitled to have a single store, single retail store authorization. That store has to be connected to their federally licensed facility.
Or one of them.
Or a federally licensed facility, right. So it's sort of the same as the craft brewery model. So the issues and concerns that might affect them are, well, A, when they're going to be allowed to do that. There's no certainty at all that come December 13th, they'll just automatically be permitted if the government continues to phase in retail store authorizations, which it's sounding like they intend to do at this point, I expect that licensed producers will be shut out until the market opens more fully. If I had to speculate, that would be my speculation. So beyond that, once a licensed producer is permitted to open a retail store, it'll have to comply with the same rules that any other provincial retailer has to comply with, which is everything we've been talking about so far.
Well, and of course, there's so many licensed producers that it would flood the market very quickly. Like if they all open up a farm store.
Right, and that's right. And I think more than half of Canada's licensed producers are based in Ontario. So.
Yeah, and I'd just like to step in about licensed producers, and we know that a lot of them are vertically integrated, and so some of them do own portions or part of retailers, and I think that's something to be very cognizant of, especially even things just having convertible debt. So, having convertible debt is still in the eyes of the regulators as being ownership of that amount, of that convertible amount. And so therefore, if you start having portion of ownership in various operations, that 9.9% could easily be broken over, right. And operators could be losing their license. That might also prevent a licensed producer from having their own store, because you already have a hand indirectly through all your various
you have an affiliate that's already operating a retail store.
That's right.
And that stops them from getting a farm license.
That might, not from their cultivation license, but for having a retail
store
in that.
License.
That license, the default rule when we go back to it will be one store for licensed producers and their affiliates combined.
Right.
So that was why the 20% of the regulation is affiliates, I guess, because the current government doesn't want to see licensed producers taking over the marketplace.
And this once again emphasizes my point of really understanding what is an affiliate, right. And how that translates to.
It's extremely broad. It could be anybody, really. It's
right.
Painfully broad. I don't know really how it would be
easily
interpreted by the AGCO, and I wish you luck in that campaign.
There's a big diagram, a process diagram of how that works, and it is like looking at it. I've done in the work that I do on the restructuring side, I look at legal documents all the time, but reading over those 11, 12 points about affiliate and referring back to the acts and other regulations where they ask you to refer to that line constantly. I keep looking at that process diagram and saying, okay, how are you affiliated? Okay, and then now you have, for example, like all these other agreements that are in place with other parties. How does that play into the role, and do you start breaking the 9.9%? I know that on a lot of the licensed producers on their financial statements indicate that in no way, shape, or form will we ever break this 9.9 on converting such debt. But that still doesn't necessarily address the issues and the regulations that they potentially could exceed the threshold when we talk about a retail operator license.
Yeah, or just be, the definition of affiliate includes categories like if you're in a joint venture with them. And the term joint venture doesn't have any single meaning at law, and it's going to be interesting.
Right.
Yeah. With 1 minute to go, maybe rapidly, Neil, what advice do you have for retailers that did not win? How are they going to position themselves for phase 2, and can you help them prevent some mistakes?
So absolutely, it's coming. So right now it's a waiting game, and that's a horrible thing to say. Make sure that you have enough money that you can wait. If you already got your leases, try to make sure that you have as little exposure as possible, because I think that happened with a lot of people who were ready before the lottery. Leases are something that expose you. Don't be exposed. It'll come. If on the second wave you're not in on the first day, then so be it. Just have your ducks in a row and be safe and don't overextend yourself.
I've also heard that a lot of individuals who had secured leases and didn't win the lottery are considering opening up vape shops. Selling cannabis accessories to sort of bide their time until they're able to apply for a cannabis retail license.
Which
with-
but that was the Tokyo smoke model from the beginning. So.
Right.
Yeah, and with that, unfortunately, we are out of time for today. For those of you on the line who have not had their questions answered, I would encourage you to reach out to any one of us who have been on the webinar today. Our contact information is on the slide that should be on your screens. Thank you for joining us.